welcome to my session. Myself, Hampika, Engineer of Electronics and Communication Engineering. Before going to the today's topic, just we would like to discuss a very brief and how the understandability of a listeners. Let me check with few discussions and interaction session. Generally, research itself, we are researching. To do research, what are the major factors we use to aware of doing research? We use it to do. We are covering in this academic session with a outline, but still research needs, research objectives, research problem statement. All these are very important to do further research to reach the criteria of a researcher. But the main thing of a research to understand very easily to readers or to others with a few type of designs, that is called a research design. Whereas for this research design there are few elements. The approach. The first and foremost part to do research is approaching about the content or a concept. In this, there are how many types of a research again? Qualitative research, quantitative research, analytical research, applied research, all this. Here, we are going with a qualitative and quantitative, or for sometimes both, along with or without a framework. Whereas elements of research also consists of a population sampling technique. And of course, the time and place of a data collection is one of the most important element to design a research. And there are few tools and methods for a data collection. And there are a few kinds of a research. There are different kinds of research designs. Here we use it to discuss about a few. There are different types of research design depending on the nature of the problem and objectives of the study again. As I previously spoke about a problem statement, the decision making of the problem statement, and how the hypothesis helps to decide the research area. Whereas here there are different types of research design dependent on the nature of the problem and objectives of the study. What are those? There are 4 types. One is explanatory research design, and the descriptive research design, and diagnostic research design, experimental research design. Again, whereas here already we discussed the experimental, non-experimental and others comes under a quantitative research design. Whereas what are the important concepts related to the research design? Before describing the different research designs, it will be very appropriate to explain various concepts relating the research design so that these may be better and easily understood. Here the dependent and independent variables. This is a concept which can take a different quantitative values. This is called a variable. A such concept like weight, income, and few other examples. Whereas qualitative phenomena always it also quantified on the basis of presence or absence of a concerning attributes phenomena which can take or on quantitatively different values even in decimal points are called continuous variables. Whereas this extraneous variable, which is the independent variable, that are not related to the purpose of the study but may affect the dependent variable. Independent variable doesn't affect individually, but independent variable changes may affect the dependent variable for sometimes. And for example, the researcher want to test the hypothesis that there is a relationship between the children's gain in a social studies achievement and their self concepts. In this case, self concept is an independent variable and social studies environment is an dependent variable, because the self concept always independent based on the student, whereas social studies achievement is dependent on the student's self concept. So that's the thing, the change of independent variable may affect the dependent variable. If I change the student, the self concept automatically it is an independent variable, there is no effect for the previous student, but the other student's self concept was changed, automatically the dependent variable of a social achievement of the other student will change. And the control, one important characteristics of a good research design is to minimize the influence or effect of extraneous variables. The technical term control is used when design the study minimizing the effects of extraneous independent variables. In experimental research, the term control is used to restrain experimental conditions, because the control itself, the word it is mentioning, it is making some certain control to that design. With this thing, automatically the design will automatically have a more impact with a few minimizing the effects of extraneous independent variables. And the other one is a confound relationship. When dependent variable is not free from the influence of external variables, the relationship between the dependent and independent variables is said to be a confounded by an external variables. And research hypothesis. When a prediction of a hypothesis relationship is to be tested by scientific methods, it is termed as a research hypothesis. The research hypothesis is a predictive statement that relates an independent variable to a dependent variable. Whereas experimental and non-experimental hypothesis testing research. Here, when the purpose of a research is to test research hypothesis, it is termed as a hypothesis testing research. It can be experimental design or the non-experimental design. But it is a hypothesis testing research termed as when the research is to test as a research hypothesis. When the purpose of research is to test a research hypothesis, then it terms as a hypothesis testing. For sometimes it can be experimental hypothesis testing, for sometimes it may not be, so that's the called non-experimental research design. Whereas research in which independent variable is manipulated is termed as a experimental hypothesis testing research. And a research in which an independent variable is not manipulated is called non-experimental hypothesis testing research. And what are the experimental and control groups again? In experimental hypothesis testing research, when a group is exposed to usual conditions, it is termed as a control group. But when the group is exposed to some novel or a special condition, it termed as an experimental group. And the other one is a treatments. The different conditions under which experimental control groups are put are usually referred as treatments, because generally the treatments itself, the word defined with a treating something, either it may be the treating any other person or a issue or a condition. Here the different conditions under which experimental and control groups are put are usually referred as the treatments. In the illustration, taken above, the two treatments are usually studies programming and the special studies programming. Then what was the experiment? Generally, from the childhood, when the person starting their studies, there is two types of studies. One is a theoretical study, the other one is experimental study. And later, when they are growing up, even we are adding the research oriented study. Then what was the experiment? The process of examining the truth of statistical hypothesis relating to some research problem is known as experiment. Because experiment itself, the experiment giving the result or either of the work progress of a problem. Based on this problem, we are going to do the experiment relevantly. So thus the thing, the process of examining the truth of a statistical hypothesis relating to some research problem is nothing but an experiment. And for example, if we conduct an experiment to examine the usefulness of certain newly developed drug, the experiments can be two types: absolute experiment and comparative experiment. Because generally the experiment is just like a finding some truth to a problem of a researcher. Whereas if for some time just we are comparing with the existing one or existing results by doing the other style of a method in an experimental way, it comes under a comparative experiment. Whereas which is very novel, even the researcher have an idea about it, to prove the idea which is applicable to doing experiment comes under absolute experiment. And experimental and control groups. In an experimental hypothesis testing research, when a group is exposed to usual conditions, it is termed a control group. But when the group is exposed to some novel or a special condition, it is termed as an experimental group. And whereas treatments again, and the different conditions under which experimental and control groups put are usually referred as a treatments. Whereas we discussed about what is the experiment, then experimental units. The predetermined plots or the blocks where different treatments are used are known as experimental units. Because in quantity manner, always units are the measurements of the experiments. If I am experimenting some relevant topic related to the frequency, then the units of a frequency is in a hertz. If it is in a weights, then the units of a weight is like based on the grams, kilograms, like that. If the some other factor based on the objectives, the units are always supposed to have the standard unit for every factor of a experiment. So that's the thing, experimental units. The predetermined plots or the blocks where different treatments are used are known as experimental units. Such experimental units must be selected very carefully. Data collection. Previously, we discussed about the topic of a data collection in a brief manner. Data collection is a term to describe a process of preparing and collecting data, which is very basic step to do any research. And the systematic gathering of data for a particular purpose from various sources that has been systematically observed, recorded, organized. And the data are the basic inputs to any decision making process in a business. And what is the purpose of data collection again? Of course, when we are collecting data, we use it to be very conscious the what type of data to do what. Again, I have some thought of research. Am I doing data collection relevantly, and from where again I am collecting? The source of data collection is also very crucial for a data collection. Generally, the purpose of data collection is to obtain information, or to keep on record, or to make decisions about important issues, to pass information on to others. One of the best example is this YouTube video lectures again. What we are doing here, we are collecting a data in the form of sessions, or for sometimes in the form of a interaction, in form of other recordings. We are recording certain data based on the requirement. With this thing, we are having some record of the data. With this record, few people are able to access the knowledge of a outsourced person even, and it is also giving the information to others in the form of a virtual manner. And this is a proof to make about any important issues. Automatically, based on this record, we are able to decide, is there any modifications to change, or is there any inputs given to the lectures, or is there any add-ons we use it to came. Even self-analysis, self-decisions, it is a record which helps for it. This is the type of a data collection, and this is one of the best example for it. Generally, we use it to store data collection in certain memory points, and nowadays it is like in air with a cloud. And then classification of data again. The data types are basically two. One is a primary data, the other one is a secondary data. Again, what is the primary data? The data which is collected from the field under the control and supervision of a invigilator. Primary data means original data that has been collected specially for the purpose in mind. This type of data are generally fresh and collected for the first time. It is useful for a current issues or current studies as well for future studies. For example, your own questionnaire. When I am listening some lecture, myself I am keeping question, why this tell me in this manner. Is there any possibility to do in a other manner? Just like that. For example, I'll give very basic example. I told 2 2s are 4 means, why don't we write 2 into 2 is equal to 4, 2 square is equal to also 4. They question themselves, but the answer is same, right? Just like that. And this primary data is always a very helpful for any research study, because it is a basic document preparing by a researcher from collecting from the different sources based on the research problem again. And this primary data is a first and foremost collection of data relevantly to reach the output or to find the solution related to the problem. And primary research methods and techniques. Primary research is a quantitative data and qualitative data again. In this research also we are segregating in a quantitative manner as well as a qualitative manner. Again, quantitative data always comes with a surveys, interviews, or a self-questioning, or a in-house or a administrated telephone or through email to through web. All this comes under this quantitative research. For this, for sometimes we go with experimental manner, or for sometimes mechanical observation, or for sometimes with the simulations again. Whereas a qualitative data is always in a focus groups, which goes for a focus groups or individual depth interviews or a human observation or a case studies. Because in a qualitative data research, primary research impact of a qualitative data is always directly to the application or directly applied in a real time on a particular focused groups. Through focused groups we are observing and we are collecting the primary data and we are doing the research on it, or through individual depth interviews again, for sometimes with a human observation, for sometimes we go with the different types of case studies on the relevant topic. Whereas a quantitative based on numbers, for example, in a percentage, 56% of 18 years old are drinking, and at least 4 times in a week doesn't tell you why and when and how. This is just a simple example with a survey. Whereas in a qualitative manner, the more detail tells you why, when, and how. For the same question, based on the numbers, what we have as statistics, here in a qualitative manner, more detailed we going with a questionnaire. And the quantitative research always in a numerical, statistically reliable, and projectable to a broader population. And here there are a few sampling methods. One is a random samples. It is like a equal chance of anyone being picked. May select those not in the large group. Indiscriminate sample sizes may need to be a large to representative can be very expensive. And what is the stratified or a segment random sampling? Samples on the basis of a representative strata or a segment, still random but not more focused, may give more relevant information, maybe the budget friendly, or maybe the more cost effective. Whereas a quota sampling is again by segment, not randomly selected. Specific number on each segment are interviewed or surveyed or etc., but may not be fully representative, and it is one of the very low budget implicable and cheaper. Whereas qualitative research, generally this qualitative research is in depth insight generating, non numerical and directional. And common techniques are personal interviews, focus groups, like based on the age groups or based on the working stream, based on some domain, and mini groups for sometimes. So these common techniques are always used for this research. And this observation methods comes with it through personal or by again a personal observation of an individual. And personal interview, it is always with a questionnaire again. Interview itself, based on the questions, based on their answers, we are taking a decisions. And telephone interview, the interview through call outcomes or call timings. And mail survey, through mailing, through questionnaire. Generally nowadays it is more in a digital survey. If we using some application, they use it to ask a feedback. It's a kind of survey. And qualitative research is completed with these observation methods. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of primary data? In primary data, we go with a qualitative research, qualitative data primary research, and quantitative data primary research. But what were the real advantages with this sector? This is a target issued and addressed. This is a data interpretation is better, and efficient spending for information, a decency of data, or property issues, address specific research issues, greater control. Because the primary data itself, it is mentioning the fresh and new one. So, based on this, where target issues and addressed is one of the main impact with this primary data. And this data is interruption is better what really existing, and it has a greater control. What were the limitations or disadvantages with this again? It is a little high cost for sometimes, because for sometimes based on this collection of data, the methods to be followed to collect this primary data, it becomes like economy incredible. For sometimes even the time consuming was very large based on the selection of a problem again. And as I previously told you, the feedbacks nowadays, the digital surveys always we are depending on our service sector with these feedbacks. On overlook, when we are as a customer or a client, we will give like a based on a random feedback, not really accurate. So for sometimes inaccurate feedbacks affects this primary data, and more number of resources is required again. So coming to the secondary data, we will discuss on a further section. Thank you. Thank you so much for your valuable listening.
Like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.